So it's certainly my pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me. It's very fascinating so far. And so this afternoon, I'm in fact going to discuss, as Georg pointed out, dipole-dipole interactions. And we're going to be probing them by microwave spectroscopy. And the work I'm going to describe was done by Paul Tanner, Bert Claessens, who was visiting from the Netherlands, Ed Schumann, and Hyunwook Park. And so I actually have a picture of, this is Jianing Han, this is Paul Tanner, and Ed Schumann on the left. So dipole-dipole interactions in Rydberg atoms are interesting for a variety of reasons. And actually, I have to admit, I've studied them for a long time. But recently, in fact, they're very popular because you can make quantum gates with them. Let's see if I can figure out how to use this. Okay, as proposed by Misha Lukin here, and recently realized in the related experiments using van der Waals interactions at Wisconsin and Orsay to make gates with two atoms in two different traps. Many people have studied resonant energy transfer due to dipole-dipole interactions. As was pointed out earlier, it's a way that you can, in fact, put a bunch of atoms in a Rydberg state and have them evolve into a plasma. But rarely are the dipole-dipole interactions studied by themselves, in some sense by themselves, and that's what we're going to do today. The first such measurements were done by James Martin and his group in Waterloo, and they, in fact, put rubidium atoms into a 45D state, and with one microwave field made a mixture of 46P and 45D, and then looked at this two-photon transition. And if they didn't put anything in it, they, in fact, saw this line width. And when they added the other Rydberg atoms, they saw the line width increase. OK, so by observing this two-photon resonance, which it turns out you can do even in the presence of the trap field, you can see 10 kilohertz wide lines. Okay, so they, in fact, only did this at fairly low densities. And what I'm going to discuss today is observing the same kind of transitions, except we're just going to look directly at a microwave transition from an NS state in rubidium to an NP state, and we're going to change the density of the atoms when we do this. Okay, so the excitation scheme is that we have a MOT, and we use the trap lasers produce a population in 5P. We drive them with 480 nanometers up to an NS state. With a microwave transition, we drive them to NP, and we detect the NP atoms. Okay, so a little bit more precisely, what this looks like is the 480 nanometer laser is pulsed. It lasts for about 5 or 6 nanoseconds. We wait a little bit. We give the atoms a microwave pulse, and then a microsecond later, we apply a field ionization pulse. And since the NP levels lie above the NS levels, they're ionized first. And we can put a gate here. And we simply sweep the frequency of the microwave over the NS to NP transition. And we look at this signal as we do it. So the principle of the experiment is quite straightforward. The apparatus is a simple magneto-optical trap, which has the parameters given over here. We use rubidium-85 just because there's more of it. And the guts of the apparatus actually, if one viewed from above, looks something like this. So because we're using the microwave horn, we actually don't want to use plates for our field plates. So we use these 4 quadrupole rods, which run in and out of the board, and we make the MOT in between them. So then if we send the microwaves in and it's polarized in the plane of the board, then the microwaves don't care about these rods. Whereas if you use something like flat plates, you have to actually, well, what typically happens is you set up resonances between the plates. Some frequencies go in and resonate, others don't go in at all, and you have absolutely no idea what you're doing. But with these rods, it seems to work pretty well. We can apply a field pulse to the back end here to push either the ions or the electrons out into a microchannel plate to detect what we see. Okay, so this is a picture of our trap. I mean, most people make traps out of nice glass cells. So ours is one of a stainless steel cell that's about a little bit larger than a grapefruit, and you can see that it has 2 big windows. So, and if you look inside, you can see the 4 vertical rods. And on the other side, those of you who are connoisseurs of Hewlett-Packard equipment will recognize that this is the side of our frequency synthesizer. And so we actually have the microwave stuff on the other side, and it shines in through a big window just like this one. So it's a pretty simple system all in all. So the first data I will show you we are taken without turning off the trap magnetic fields. Okay? If you don't turn off the trap magnetic fields, you can of course have a higher density, but then you do in fact have some broadening due to the presence of the trap fields. And so the minimum line widths that we ever see are something like 3 megahertz. So just to remind you again of what I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you what we see as we in fact sweep the microwave frequency through the transition. And this is populating the 39S state of rubidium, looking at the 39P state, and you can clearly see at low density you see a very nice sharp line, and at high density it broadens substantially. I should point out the frequency scale here is in gigahertz, so from here, so each of these little hash marks is 10 megahertz. The scale that James Martin was looking at the broadening on was 10 kilohertz. Okay, so we also in fact did similar experiments. One of the things we worried about was do you get a completely different answer if you turn the field off? So we in fact also have learned how to turn the fields off, although we have to wait for about 15 milliseconds for the magnetic fields to totally go away. But this usually means that you wind up with a lower density, although it's not as bad as you might think because you still always have an optical molasses present. But in any case, you can get to the point where the line width that you see is basically due to the time that you have the microwaves on, so that you in fact can get transform limited pulses. And so this is the same kind of thing, except now it's 42S to 42P. And once again, you see similar broadening. I mean, it's not quite as much, but you see exactly the same thing. Okay, so if I back up for a second. So there's obvious broadening, and the other obvious thing that you can sort of see by looking at this is that these are not exactly Lorentzian lines. They're sort of cusp-shaped lines. Okay? But not to be worried about minor details, we thought, okay, so we're experimental hacks, and so first thing we thought we would do is measure the widths of these lines as a function of density. We're trying to find what you might view as pressure broadening. So we did this, and you can, so this is in fact looking at the broadening of these transitions for several different states. We did a whole bunch of them, and in fact they all broadened, and of course the broadening goes up with n. And these are at this point plotted on a completely arbitrary scale. The dotted lines are what you expect for the dipole-dipole broadening, that is to say something that goes up as n to the fourth. And so this is just a comparison of what we saw for the broadening rates with what you compute from basically the square of the dipole moments divided by the cube of the spacing between the atoms. Now, one of the things that we observed is at higher ends, we found that actually the broadening sort of saturates. I mean, as you turn up the number density up here, it doesn't get any broader. And at first we thought this was due to the onset of a plasma. Okay? But then you can do it with lower lying states, and it still happens. And in fact, you can turn the field off, the magnetic field off, and it still happens at substantially lower densities. And so this really isn't right. So it's not becoming a plasma. They're in fact saturating for some other reason. Okay, so this is, okay, all right. These data, if you actually looked at the raw scans, look something like this. And to those in the audience who recognize that these little side bumps here are not noise, but that's what you expect to see. Okay, that's the Rabi line shape. Okay, so in any case, the question is, why do you get the line shape that you get? And in fact, you get the line shape that you get for two reasons. One, which is what I was thinking in the first place, is, as I will show you in a second, you can in fact have 1 and 2 photon transitions in the same system. And I thought this would be the predominant effect. The other effect is that you have a distribution of spacings, which Francis has been selling hard. Okay, and later you will get to decide for yourself which of these two is more important. But in any case, to account for the fact that you have 1 and 2 photon transitions, we used a three-level model of a diatomic molecule to compute the transition probability. And then to take care of the fact that you have a Gaussian distribution of densities, we in fact have to average over the density distribution of the trap. Now, in doing all of this, we assume that all that matters is the nearest neighbor. Okay? We throw everybody else out, okay, which is not completely crazy. The next furthest away atom is definitely farther away. And if you average over all the other atoms, the dipole distribution is 0. So we're throwing them away. Okay, so the way that you actually do this calculation is something like this. So we assume the axis of quantization is the microwave field, which is linearly polarized. If I have two atoms, say one s and one p, you can compute the dipole-dipole interaction, and it looks just like this, and also ignore any spins. Okay, so in fact, the dipole-dipole distribution, the dipole-dipole coupling gives you symmetric combinations of state, a symmetric and antisymmetric states. You can have sp plus ps and sp minus ps. And in the symmetric states, if the two atoms are like this, okay, if the field is this way, if the two atoms are like this, they're repulsive, but if they're like this, they're attractive, okay? And it's exactly the other way around for the antisymmetric case. So the symmetric and antisymmetric states look like this. In either case, the average shift is 0 if you average over everybody. Okay, so so the three states that we have and the 1 and 2 photon transitions are the following. So we in fact start with atoms, well I shouldn't say, we start with two atoms. So our initial state is a molecule. It's 34s, 34s. I have no idea where they are relative to each other. And if I excite either one of them to 34p, I assume that I make the symmetric combination of this, which looks like this. So, and its energy as a function of internuclear spacing will fall between these two lines, which aren't quite drawn right, but anyway. So it depends where exactly the actual energy of this state depends upon where the atoms are relative to each other. So in fact, if I have the two atoms like this, and they're in the symmetric state, they're down here. But if they're like this in the symmetric state and the same distance apart, they're up here. So where this curve lies depends upon theta. Okay, so in the states that lie in here, I have one of the two atoms excited. And of course, eventually I can excite both of the two atoms. Okay, and so now imagine that I have atoms at some finite spacing r. So then if I in fact put in a microwave photon this big, I can in fact drive the atoms if they're if they're on the attractive part of the potential, or that is to say if they're like this, I can drive them to here. Okay, and so if they were this far apart, I could drive them here. If they're here, if they were like this, I'd drive them up here somewhere. But at the same time, even if they're here, I can always drive this two-photon transition up to 34p squared, right? And what I'm finally detecting always, and I'm assuming that I just blithely can project things back into isolated atoms. So I'm detecting 34p atoms. I get two of them here, and I only get one of them here. So either way, I get a signal. Okay, all right. So the three-level, all right, this is just the three-level picture again. The other, I mean, I assume this is my microwave field. I have this dipole coupling between them. So the other two things that are interesting or important are the detuning of the microwave frequency from the isolated atomic frequency, which I'll call little delta, and big delta, which depends on both the spacing between the atoms and where they are relative to each other, is how far this sp and ps state are shifted from the r equals infinity spacing. Okay, so with these three states, the wave function has to look like this. It's simply a linear superposition of psi1, psi2, and psi3, and it will have time-dependent coefficients. But I know that initially everybody's here, okay, in state 1. Okay, so when I turn on the microwave field, those three states aren't the eigenstates. And the easiest way to describe this is using a Floquet or dress state description. So, and we're also going to use the rotating wave approximation. But, so I in fact start with the SS state and I leave it alone. From the SP plus PS state that's one photon away, I subtract one microwave photon from it. And from the PP state, I subtract two microwave photons. So now all of these three states are pretty close to each other. They're sort of, the energy scale of this problem is little delta, the microwave detuning from the atomic frequency, and big delta, which is the dipole-dipole shift. Okay. So the actual spacing between these levels has now disappeared from the problem. Okay. Okay, and so I can in fact solve this problem and find its eigenstates. Okay, and these will be the eigenstates in the presence of the microwave field. Okay. So I solve that problem by just diagonalizing this Floquet matrix. So here's our SS state. It's coupled to the S plus P state, which is detuned from the microwaves. Sorry, the microwave frequency is detuned from the atomic frequency, and it has this van der Waals dipole-dipole shift. And this state is in turn coupled to the PP state, again by chi, which is this matrix element, which is detuned by twice the microwave frequency. Okay, all right. So then, how do you actually do this? So for each value of r, theta, and omega, you can calculate the Floquet eigenstates. You simply project the initial state, that's both atoms in the S state, onto the Floquet state, and you just let them evolve for the duration of the microwave pulse. Okay? And then you project those Floquet states back onto the undressed states, if you want to call them that, and calculate the transition probability, which is B is the probability that I have a PS atom, or PS molecule, and C is the probability they have a PP. So this is weighted by a half because it's only half P. Okay, so one of the attractions of this, I know that this sounds really complicated perhaps, but this does reduce to the correct limit also if you have an isolated atom. Okay, so all right, I can now come back to the question of, so which is more important, this two-photon transition versus one photon, or the distribution of the final states? Okay. Well, the easiest way to see that is to just look at the calculation of what we get for the transition probability for some value of r. Okay, so we'll imagine that all values of theta are present, but the two atoms are at some fixed spacing, and so I'm letting one atom's here and the other one is all over a sphere. And what you see is this. Okay, so this is the dipole-dipole, or the range of the dipole-dipole interaction. It's half as far on this side as it is on this side. And this is the two-photon peak. So I have to say, looking at this, Francis is right. I was worried about this little peak, but it's clear that the basic effect that gives you the line shape is the fact that as you raise the density, this whole thing just blows up, and as you go to low density, it shrinks down to a narrow spike. Okay, so what Francis said is correct. Okay, and okay, so this is a computed curve, and in fact, if you then just look at what you compute at several different densities, at 0 density, there's no broadening. At 1.5 times 10 to the 9th, it looks like that, and 3 times 10 to the 9th, it looks like this. So you can, in fact, take the full widths at half maximum out of that model, and they look like this, which look like what we saw. Now, okay, so you could ask, well, why do you get the cusp-shaped line, and why do you get the saturation of the widths? Well, basically, it's because when you, in fact, when you raise the density, what you're really doing is you could think of adding atoms on the edge of the trap, and as you raise the density of the stuff in the center, its frequency spectrum is just going out like this, and so you just don't see it. So you always see the stuff that's on the edge because it's located in a small part of the spectrum. And in fact, the corollary to this is the way we're analyzing this is not the right way. If you want to get any information out of the high densities, what you need to do is to look at the wings. Okay, and so I will show you, just quickly show you these. And so I'm changing the density here, which is written on the top. And as I raise the density, the full width at half maximum these are calculations, doesn't change at all. But what happens is if you look at how far this width, or the pedestal extends, it's clearly going up a lot. And in fact, when we took these data, actually these are the relative densities, and what's been done here, of course, is that they've all been put on the same scale, and what has not been paid attention to is the fact that they're not, I mean, this one clearly has a baseline that's here, this baseline is still going down, and so we have to actually analyze these more carefully. Okay, so the other interesting thing that we have observed is that sometimes we see a preponderance of the shift to the low frequency side. And in fact, if you do this model, you conclude that it ought to be on the high frequency side. I mean, it could be that my claim that we should only see the symmetric state is wrong. I mean, if you take into account the spins, it's not obvious that you start in a symmetric state. But in that case, but even in that case, then I believe you would just get a completely symmetric line. So the other question that immediately comes up to the awake experimentalist is one that Pierre Piet has pointed out to me several times, that what if you have some ions, which we weren't paying so much attention to? The reason that that's important in this particular case is that the polarizabilities of the p states are much bigger than the polarizabilities of the s states. And if you have any ions, it will move the p states down in energy. And so it will, in fact, shift these things to, it will in fact, produce a low-frequency wing. So we recently have added ions to this transition. And if there's, oh, okay, this should say no ions, sorry. If there are no ions, the transition frequency is here. And if you add ions, and so this is a trace detecting the the ions and the 42S signal. And with this number of ions, you get the trace that's shown right here. So this is a shift of about 1 megahertz, which corresponds to a field of about 300 millivolts per centimeter. Now, we usually didn't have, I don't think, this many ions, but we have to check this. So this, of course, is potentially a problem, and we have to check this to be sure. But while doing this, I'm reminded of something Steve Ralston said. Okay, so this is a colossal headache in a way for us. But you can turn this around, and it might actually turn out to be interesting. Now, namely, we can measure the fields that are present in the plasma by actually looking at these transitions in the Rydberg states. I mean, after we realized this, then I realized that, okay, this is not an original idea. A long time ago, Jim Lawler had pointed out that you could measure the fields in discharges by essentially this technique, except it was using optical spectroscopy. So we decided to try this by making a very dilute plasma and then making Rydberg atoms and looking at this transition I just showed you. So when you do this, if you have no plasma, this is what you see. This is all done in the presence of our trap fields. And so we wind up with several megahertz wide lines. And if you, in fact, excite the atoms to the Rydberg state 100 nanoseconds after you make the plasma, you can't even see. Well, you can just barely see this. If you wait half a microsecond, the field is calmed down to about half a volt per centimeter. And as the plasma slowly expands, you can see that the field slowly goes to zero as the field inside the plasma goes to zero. Now, if you don't think that's enough sensitivity, of course, instead of looking at an S to P transition, which gives you this shift in this plasma, which is about half a volt per centimeter, you could try looking at a D to F transition and in the same plasma that's just completely gone. So it's clear that you can measure any shift that you want. Okay, so I would like to actually come back to maybe a more positive aspect of microwaves and dipole interactions. So, which is the notion of a different kind of blockade. So the initial proposals by Michel Lucan were based on permanent dipoles in a static field, which have a variety of problems. But in any case, you could imagine asking, well, what would happen if I could make dipoles that oscillated together? I mean, they don't have to be like this. All that matters is their relative orientation. So if I could make a dipole that looked like this and then looked like this later and just oscillated back, make two of them that oscillated back and forth in time so that they were like this, and then they were zero, and then they were oppositely pointed, I would only lose a factor of 2 in the dipole-dipole interaction. And you wouldn't have to have you might not have to have a field, ions, etc. Okay, so in fact, you can make such things if you produce what we call Phaselock dipoles in a resonant microwave field. So this, if you're familiar with the Flow-Cave description, this is all completely obvious. But if I have an S and a P state, and I put on a microwave field that's pretty close in frequency to the intrinsic frequency I make these flow K states that are S, P, S plus 1 photon, P minus 1 photon. The key is that I have two states that are close together, in both cases, that are just separated by the detuning from the resonance. Okay? So if I then crank up the magnitude of this coupling field, what happens is that this pair of states, or this one, which are the same, just split in energy. And as long as the spacing between them, which is called the Rabi frequency, is relatively large, it actually becomes linear. And these are, in fact, the flow K energies. Okay? The flow K energy is the time averaged energy. Right? So the field is oscillating at cosine omega t. I have a time averaged energy. So the dipoles are also oscillating at cosine omega t. So in this case, I have a dipole that's aligned with the field. And in this case, I have a dipole that's aligned out of the field. So if I, in fact, apply a microwave field in resonance, I should be able to make phase-lock dipoles. I guess I should and so the way that we thought we would do this, well, we've tried several ways. But what I will show you today is by coupling this pair of states with a strong microwave field, and then we're going to probe it this way. So our friendly competitors in Wisconsin have also been working on this, and I think have seen somewhat similar results, or at least in May they had. So what I'm going to do is now couple these two levels together with the microwave field. It will produce a splitting of this state, which we will probe by driving the transition from this 42S state. Okay. So in fact, this is what you see as you scan the frequency of the microwaves, driving them from 42S to 42P. So this splitting is the Rabi splitting, and as you change the density, you can see that it actually it broadens slightly, but it's okay. At first blush, these densities are pretty high, and if you just looked at the broadening of the transition by itself, it's something that's clearly more. Okay, but then actually, okay, I realized when I was first looking at these, I of course was always looking up here, right? I mean, somehow mentally I always look at the half width, right? I can't help it. But if you look carefully at these transitions, the black one, which is the low density one, it comes along here and then goes up and comes down. The red one, which is at high density, starts way over here, right? And goes up and is still going down over here. We didn't go far enough. So in fact, if you think back to what I had said earlier, what you see at high density is almost no effect at the full width at half maximum. Where you see the effect is in the wing. So in fact, I think this actually probably works pretty well. We have to do it a little bit more carefully. But I mean, this is the kind of broadening you see in a MOT. You don't see the half width get so much bigger. What you see is that you get all this stuff sort of on the base that's coming from the very center of the MOT. Okay. Okay. So in conclusion, I guess what we have learned are the following. Okay, so the dipole-dipole interactions are just as large as they're supposed to be, all right? But we sort of already believe that. Okay, something which I had not expected is that in a MOT, basically, this doesn't lead to just simple Lorentzian broadening. I mean, you don't just get things that have a full width at half maximum that go up linearly with the density. It saturates. And finally, the microwave techniques actually may be quite useful. I mean, you might be able to make gates to make these states with the oscillating dipole moments to make gates. And I also think they could be a very interesting diagnostic tool for examining plasmas, such as the ones that Steve and Tom talked about earlier today. Okay, with that, I thank you for your attention.
I guess I'm not quite clear what the advantage of the oscillating dipoles over the static dipoles is. The static electric field doesn't seem that hard to have.
Well, it probably depends on how stable the static electric field is. I mean, because if you tune it with a field, you basically have to have that field completely under your control. I actually am more than happy to pay Hewlett-Packard and have them tell me that the frequency is completely under their control. I mean, I just think it's much easier to control.
Tom, were your P states P1 and
It's that. Oh, good question. In the first part of the talk, it was P1/2. The last things I showed were the first part of the talk was P3/2. The last part is P1/2. Good question. But it doesn't seem to, I mean, we don't see any huge difference between them. No.
Yes. Can you predict how your line width and its dependence on number density would be dependent on the translational temperature? So you have 300 microkelvin, but if it's molecular beam?
Versus a molecular beam.
Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, what kind of temperature? Well,
1 Kelvin, say.
1 Kelvin. Okay, so if you have 1 Kelvin, you're in the regime that Pierre Piet was talking about this morning. At 1 Kelvin, okay, at 300 microkelvin, basically the atoms, in the time of an experiment, two atoms move a few % of the spacing between them. At 1 Kelvin, in the time of the experiment, they go past. So at 1 Kelvin, it's a collision experiment. Okay, so somewhere in between those two, I can't answer it, but at 1 Kelvin, I'm absolutely sure it's a collision experiment.
So from your modeling of the spectrum, I assume that the van der Waals shifts of the SS pairs and the PP pairs didn't matter?
In this case, okay,
okay.
That's a good question, in fact. So we were going to look at these, make these oscillating dipoles, and we were originally going to do this by probing them in a completely benign way, namely doing SS transitions. So it turns out that some of these SS states have enormous van der Waals shifts, much larger than I expected, but they're still small on this scale. And so we ignored them, but they can be really important. But they're not in this particular case. If you try to drive the transition from NS to N+1S, when you get if you think of a pair of them, if you drive one of the atoms to N+1S and leave one in NS, suddenly you get a humongous van der Waals shift. But, okay.
Yes?
So at higher temperatures, the line shape would go back to the Lorentzian line shape?
Actually, no. That's a good question, but in fact, at higher you always have a distribution basically you have a distribution of the times during which the atoms collide, or equivalently, how far away they are, or the impact parameter of the collision. And when you average over all of that, you still get a cusp. Yeah, I mean, and in fact, if you look in the literature on of resonant collisions of these Rydberg atoms at higher temperatures, the line shapes are all cusps. Not all the authors, like me, understood it always, but they are cusps.
Okay, so if there's no more questions, let's thank Tom again.